But let's speak to the Africans that don't have Jewish privilege and don't have Western privilege, specifically the 50,000 African asylum seekers. They've escaped from torturous conditions, ethnic cleansing, government persecution, authoritarian regimes, mainly from Sudan and Eritrea. And they're fleeing in every direction. You know, thousands of refugees are fleeing Eritrea every month. It's the only country in the world that's never had a democratic election in its, since it's been established. So, or one of the only ones that has never had an election, a national election. So we're talking about like massive amounts of people that are fleeing all over the world. And for a lot of them, how are they treated when they come to Israel? In the last 6 years, 7 years, you've got about 50, 60,000 who have entered the country. Well, police are sent to stop and frisk black people in downtown Tel Aviv, check their papers. Oh, are you, this guy looks Jewish, but are you really Jewish? Let's see, what kind of papers do you have? If you're Jewish, okay, we'll let you go on your way. If you're not, okay, we're rounding you up. And the goal of the government is to round up these Africans and to take them into these desert detention centers where they are held potentially indefinitely without any hope of a release date. The idea is to incarcerate them for as long as they like until they agree to self-deport back to the horrors they fled from. And the irony is that for many of these refugees, the reason that they came to Israel to begin with is because they felt a sense of identification with Jewish history. This is on Holocaust Remembrance Day, when the African refugees at Cholot, at that internment center, are standing for a moment of silence to remember the victims of the Nazi Holocaust. And it's not just the history of World War II. Also on the holiday of Passover, they celebrate and these are Muslim and Christian people, right? They're not Jewish people. But they had a Passover celebration because for many of them, they identified as people who fled genocide. They identify with the Holocaust story as people who have escaped from the slavery regime of Eritrea. They appreciate the Jewish narrative of the Exodus, of fleeing slavery. And that's the reason that many of them came. And even for those African refugees who want to convert to Judaism, who want to be part of this national story, the conversion czar in Israel, there actually is a thing, said very specifically, the government built a fence on the border to stop African immigration, and we built one here at the entrance gate to the Jewish people. The government has not permitted even one African refugee. There have been hundreds that have applied, zero, none have been allowed to convert to Judaism. Why is that? Here we're talking about tens of thousands who want to assimilate into us and have no connection to Judaism. You often hear, oh, we're not racist. We allow anyone to convert to Judaism, except if they're African. And it wasn't a shock because I'd already heard this in person from the justice minister a couple of years earlier, him saying, it's impossible to allow anyone to convert to Judaism because it permits anyone to receive citizenship. They don't want black people in the country, so they don't want to allow them to convert to Judaism, because then they will be able to get citizenship. Now, this man also, it was reported in Forbes magazine, is the richest politician in Israel. He has a net worth of 100 million shekels. And I bring that up because it's not only base racism. Sure, that plays a huge role in this, why so many politicians in Israel incite racism against African people. But it's not only racism. It's also capitalism, because politicians like him profit from a different class of workers. See, until a couple decades ago, most of the manual labor in Israel, the grunt work, was done by Palestinians. But because of the intifadas, there was an effort to reduce the dependency on Palestinian labor in Israel. And so as a result, the government started bringing in foreign workers from the Far East. The idea is that Asian people are more demure, and so that they're less headstrong and they won't and they'll be more submissive to Israelis. And so they brought in, to do agricultural work, they brought in men from Thailand. And to do caretaking work, they brought in women from the Philippines. And to do construction work, they brought in men from China. But if you have this group of 50, 60,000 Africans in the country, they're already in the country, they're already a labor force, then no one can profit from bringing in these people. See, those foreign workers, the government, there are corporations who actually make money. They pay for the privilege of being able to come to Israel and work for a pittance. So there are companies that profit from it, and then those very companies contribute to the election campaigns of these racist politicians who incite racism against the Africans, because they don't want the African workers here, because they want to be able to make money off of bringing in East Asian workers. So the politicians that get the most money from these so-called human resources companies, little more than glorified slave traders, they're the ones that incite racism the most. Like this woman, Miri Regev. She said famously in 2012 at a rally of thousands of Israelis, the Sudanese, that's a catchphrase for Africans in Israel, the Sudanese are a cancer in our body. And this set off a race riot, which for hours, 1,000 Israelis ran rampant through the streets of Tel Aviv, smashing African stores and attacking any dark-skinned person they came across. And afterwards, she actually made a public apology, but she didn't apologize to Africans for comparing them to cancer. She apologized to cancer victims. Sorry, I did not intend to hurt cancer patients. She apologized to cancer victims for comparing them to Africans, if you can imagine. And famously, Eli Yishai, then the interior minister of the country, has had much to say about Africans. Most are Muslims who think the country doesn't belong to us white men. They bring with them a profusion of diseases, tuberculosis, AIDS, and drugs. Until I am able to deport them, I'll jail them and make their lives miserable. This is the government policy, make their lives miserable. The government doesn't want to outright deport them because it would just look horrific on the human rights record of the country to send them back to the tortures they fled from. So the idea is don't allow them to work, pack them into the neighborhoods that are poor to begin with, increasing racial tensions with the locals who are already living in poverty, thereby, ramping up racism against them, until they just give up, realize that they will never be able to eke out a living or make a better future for themselves or their families, and just agree to go back to the tortures they fled from. So I'll just summarize the policy for you to kind of break it down. It's really simple. IRE, right? Ire, like anger. It's an acronym for incite, riot, and expel. This is the government policy. So first you have the politicians inciting the racism, calling them diseased, saying they're responsible for violence and for terrorism and all kinds of stuff that have no basis, and police records show just the contrary. But inciting racism against them. Then when people are riled up, then local politicians say, whoa, you better take these people out of here, because if you don't round them up, we're going to take matters into our own hands. And then the government can just say, well, there's the threat of violence. Well, we're just going to come and solve the problem by scooping them up and rounding them up off the streets and expelling them from the streets of Tel Aviv. So now that the government has rounded thousands of Africans into these desert detention centers, again, the process continues, another round. So the new interior minister, again, incites racism. And then, like the mayor of the area says, well, if you don't get them out of here, this internment center is a blight on our community. Just having this concentration camp in our vicinity is pissing us off. And unless you round them out of here, out of the country altogether, we're just going to have no choice but to beat them up. And so with that threat of a riot, then the government's like, okay, well, let's just, not just enough that they're in these concentration camps, but now we got to push them back into Africa, make their lives miserable until they agree to self-deport. So that's the IRE plan of the government. And so this is the situation till this day. And of course, these people realize, they fled for their lives, and yet now they're rounded into these camps, and there's no hope on the horizon of anything coming of it. And sure, it's not all the Africans. The camp only fits about 3,000 people. So what about the rest of the 50,000? many of them are in Tel Aviv, and at this point, the racism against them is so great that even on the weekends when they meet to remember to have memorial services for their family members who have been butchered by the regimes they fled from and who have been tortured by human traffickers as they fled the country, and there are many horrific stories of this. So these survivors of genocide and survivors of slave trading, they come on the weekends to a park so they can have like a memorial ritual, and Israelis will come and with whistles, and they'll shriek with these whistles so that even their memorial services are disturbed, chasing them out of public parks, chasing them out of public spaces. This is the level of racism against Africans in Israel today. I don't need to mention that in January, an Israeli Jewish man walked up to a 1-year-old African baby being held by her mother and stabbed the baby in the head 3 times. The man who did it, again, surprise, surprise, is claiming insanity. And the mother, she hasn't received any, in Israel, people receive help from the government if they're the victims of terror attacks, but she's received no help from the government. And yet, the father of this child has since been deported to that internment camp for Africans. So this is how Africans are treated. It doesn't matter if you have children, you're sent to the camp. It doesn't matter if you have an Israeli partner and you're living together and you have a family, you're still sent to the camp. Sure, some people are released. Very rarely. They did release this man after they dragged him from Tel Aviv, where he was living just fine. He had a job. He was able to support himself. They rounded him into the camp, and then he was traumatized. He had a stroke. But of course, since they don't provide any serious medical facilities there, and they didn't believe him and couldn't care less when he started complaining of pains, he sat there for days suffering from the stroke. When they finally took him to the hospital, he lost permanently all control of half of his body. Now he's completely incapacitated. Now he has medical needs that require, medical services. Now we release him from jail. Now that you can't even afford to, uphold yourself and take care of yourself, and we don't want to have to pay for you. Now that we gave you a stroke, now you're on your own. So this man is like the only man that they've released from their detention center, pretty much. And of course, people realize that there's no way out. So they've started to protest, and they have furloughs a couple times a day for a couple hours. They're allowed to walk out. So they walked out into the desert, protesting, marching. They're saying, okay, fine, we get the picture, Israel. You don't want us here, fine, we'll leave. We'll go to UN-controlled territory. But, that wasn't good enough. And the Israeli government, sure enough, rounded them back in forcefully into these detention centers. And that's the state of affairs today. Now, when you see these images of Africans being rounded into camps, and you hear these stories, you have to ask yourself, what possible answer can the Israeli government give to this horrific phenomenon? What can they possibly say in their defense?